uma história que começou em 1963. Com décadas dedicadas ao desenvolvimento de processos, produtos e embalagens, o Instituto de Tecnologia de Alimentos não mede esforços para se manter como referência no setor alimentício, não só no Brasil, como no mundo. Por entender a importância da inovação e segurança de alimentos, bebidas e embalagens para o consumidor, o ITAL pesquisa e presta assessoria técnica, visando a eficácia e padrões mínimos de qualidade. Além de estar atento aos diferentes perfis de consumidor, o Instituto atua sempre com ética e respeito ao meio ambiente, priorizando a análise crítica para acompanhar a evolução tecnológica e de mercado. As atividades do ITAL são divididas em 3 grandes áreas. A tecnologia é desenvolvida e aplicada nas unidades especializadas em carnes, cereais, chocolates, balas, confeitos, produtos de panificação, laticínios, frutas, hortaliças e engenharias de processo. A ciência e a qualidade são prioridades dos laboratórios de análises químicas, físicas, sensoriais e microbiológicas. A embalagem é o foco dos setores especializados em materiais metálicos, vidros, plásticos, celulósicos e para distribuição e transporte. E o conhecimento vai além dos muros da instituição através de artigos, publicações e eventos. O ITAL valoriza as pessoas que são força de trabalho e razão de existência. Por isso, está presente em importantes programas de governo que abrangem todas as classes e diferentes gerações. São décadas de constante reinvenção, aprendendo e ensinando, décadas de reconhecimento com a bagagem do passado e a modernidade do presente. Com funcionários qualificados, clientes, parceiros e fundações de apoio, o ITAL tornou-se fundamental no setor de alimentos, bebidas e embalagens.
Because you take your job as seriously as we do. With over 350 years' experience in highly regulated industries, we understand the importance of reliability and efficiency in your lab. So be it to verify existing methods, stay on top of changing regulations, or to adopt the newest technologies. You can find it all on sigmaaldrich.com. Tailored products for each step of your workflow available on our website. We have products that are suitable for microbial and analytical needs in
Uma história que começou em 1963. Com décadas dedicadas ao desenvolvimento de processos, produtos e embalagens, o Instituto de Tecnologia de Alimentos não mede esforços para se manter como referência no setor alimentício, não só no Brasil, como no mundo. Por entender a importância da inovação e segurança de alimentos, bebidas e embalagens para o consumidor, o ITAL pesquisa e presta assessoria técnica, visando a eficácia e padrões mínimos de qualidade. Além de estar atento aos diferentes perfis de consumidor, o Instituto atua sempre com ética e respeito ao meio ambiente, priorizando a análise crítica para acompanhar a evolução tecnológica e de mercado. As atividades do ITAL são divididas em 3 grandes áreas. A tecnologia é desenvolvida e aplicada nas unidades especializadas em carnes, cereais, chocolates, balas, confeitos, produtos de panificação, laticínios, frutas, hortaliças e engenharias de processo. A ciência e a qualidade são prioridades dos laboratórios de análises químicas, físicas, sensoriais e microbiológicas. A embalagem é o foco dos setores especializados em materiais metálicos, vidros, plásticos, celulósicos e para distribuição e transporte. E o conhecimento vai além dos muros da instituição através de artigos, publicações e eventos. O ITAL valoriza as pessoas que são força de trabalho e razão de existência. Por isso, está presente em importantes programas de governo que abrangem todas as classes e diferentes gerações. São décadas de constante reinvenção, aprendendo e ensinando, décadas de reconhecimento com a bagagem do passado e a modernidade do presente. Com funcionários qualificados, clientes, parceiros e fundações de apoio, o ITAL tornou-se fundamental no setor de alimentos, bebidas e embalagens.
Because you take your job as seriously as we do. With over 350 years' experience in highly regulated industries, we understand the importance of reliability and efficiency in your lab. So be it to verify existing methods, stay on top of changing regulations, or to adopt the newest technologies. You can find it all on sigmaaldrich.com. Tailored products for each step of your workflow available on our website. We have products that are suitable for microbial and analytical needs in
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I am Marta Taniwaki from the Institute of Food Technology, Vital in Brazil. And together with my colleague, Dr. Silvia Raffelini from the National University of Luján, Argentina, we will chair today the LAS-ICMSF Webinar. I am pleased to inform you that the 2 days video of this webinar are available in the icmsf.org website. And also you can, the link is already in the chat of YouTube, so you can access the 2 days video. Many people were asking about this video, so they are already on. There, it's not all the video, the lectures that are there, but most of them are there, okay? And I also want to tell that you can also access the several other videos of ICMSF, as Dr. Marcel Zetrin said in the beginning. And there are several videos, 19 videos of the same topics and other topics that we covered during this webinar. and some of them have the subtitle in Portuguese, in Spanish, so you can access all of them free. And there are also position papers in all several talks there. So visit our website, icmsf.org. So on Tuesday, we discussed the model were on use of data for assessing process control. And yesterday on microbiological criteria for product acceptance. Today's module is on food and COVID-19 transmission, myths and facts. It will be presented in the current context of food safety, an issue that has caused great concern and doubts among consumers and professionals working in the food production chain. And let me introduce you the first speaker, Dr. Lucia Annelisch. And I also want to ask you to use the link for the questions. So if you have any questions, there is a link for questions, and send us this question. So Dr. Lucia Annelisch is ICMSF member since 2005, director of Annelisch Consulting in South Africa. She's focused on food safety consulting and training business, being instrumental in assisting industry and government. She spent 25 years at the Wayne University of Technology, where she was the head of department and associate professor. She served as food hygiene technical expert on several FAO WHO committees and consults for FAO and UNIDO. Dr. Lucia Annelisch has contributed greatly around the world with her lectures on this subject on COVID and food. So today the talk, her talk is SARS-CoV-2, is it a food safety risk? So Dr. Lucia, thank you very much, and please use this time for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak to you here today about this topic on SARS-CoV-2. Is it a food safety risk? And as Marta said, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I would just like to say, to start off with, that the information that I'm presenting today is correct at the time of presentation, because so much new information is being discovered about this virus as we learn more about it going further into the pandemic. So information may change, and so it would be a good thing to just keep an eye on different websites, especially the food safety and government authority websites, as to the latest information related to SARS-CoV-2. And I do try and keep my own website updated as much as possible, particularly with South African information. So the first virus of this kind that appeared was in the years 2002, 2003, which was the first SARS virus. Of course, we've been exposed for many, many, many decades to human coronaviruses, and there are many different kinds of human coronaviruses. And most often we don't really pay too much notice about that, because they don't cause these kind of epidemics and severe influenza outbreaks that we have seen. The MERS virus, which is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, popped up in the year 2012 when it was mostly associated in the Arabian Peninsula, where it is associated with camels. And then, of course, the latest virus, which is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which has caused the pandemic that we are currently experiencing at the moment, which popped up in 2019. The thing about these viruses, and there are also many animal coronaviruses too, they all belong to the family Coronaviridae, which is a very large family. And the things that they have in common is that they are enveloped viruses. They contain, in other words, a fatty layer or a lipid layer around the virus. And in a way, we should be grateful for that, because it means that we can actually get rid of this virus quite easily by simply washing hands with soap, because the soap interacts with the fatty layer, breaks it open, and then the virus is exposed. And in that way, it can be inactivated. They also have single-stranded RNA, and that also has to do with the fact that they, when they replicate, they can mutate actually quite easily, because there are errors in the replication or in the genetic code as such during the replication phase. And the RNA virus tend to be more susceptible to these errors than, for example, DNA viruses. They also contain these protein club-shaped spikes that you can see in all these pictures on the screen. And they are creating a kind of a crown-like appearance around the virus, and hence the term coronavirus. And these spikes are really important because they are responsible for identifying the ACE2 receptors on the respiratory cells, so that when they can attach to the cells in that way, they then initiate the infection process of infecting those particular cells. So without the protein spikes, the identification of ACE2 receptors is not possible. And this is an important point that I'd like to highlight right now, because I'm going to get to that a little later when we look at how we test for these viruses, when we look at PCR testing, for example. So if we look at the three important viruses, the SARS virus active in those years, as I mentioned, had an R0 value of between 2 and 4 people. Now, the R0 value is the number of people that an infected individual can go on to infect. So one infected individual can infect 2 to 4 people, and those 2 to 4 people, and each one of those people goes on to infect another 2 to 4 people each. And so you get this massive spread of these kind of viruses. And so ideally, one would like to have an R0 value of less than 1. It was first reported in China. It caused about 8,098 infections, and deaths that were recorded were 774. And if you just take a simple death to infection ratio, it's around 9.5% of death rate that was recorded for that particular virus. The MERS virus was active initially in 2012, and there are still very, very few, but here and there, a report every now and then of someone who has been infected with this virus. So it hasn't completely disappeared, like, for example, the initial SARS virus has. The R0 value is less than 1 person. It was first reported in Saudi Arabia. Infections were around 2,521. And the deaths that were recorded were 866. Now, this translates to a 34% death rate, which is actually really high. In other words, a third of everyone who got infected with this virus died from it. The current SARS virus, on the other hand, we don't know what the final R0 value will be. It is constantly changing. Initially, of course, it was pretty high amongst most countries, and we've seen with these second and third and fourth waves that R0 values can actually be pretty high. It was first reported in China, as you know, and infection numbers are currently, as of yesterday, the 14th of April, and the Johns Hopkins University website does provide really good updates on the number of infections and deaths, not only globally, but also according to various regions. And so as of yesterday, 137.5 million people have been infected, and the deaths are in the region of 3 million. And again, if you just take a simple death to infection ratio, you're looking at a 2 to 3% death rate. So while the death rate is lower than the others, this is a much, much more infectious virus that is causing obviously higher death rates because of that. So when we look at transmission, we know that person-to-person transmission through close contact with another individual who is infected is the main route of transmission. Also, people can become infected through droplets via coughing or sneezing, when those droplets contain virus. We also know now, of course, that aerosols can contribute to transmission as well. And this is a problem indoors where there's very little fresh air, or where there's poor ventilation, or, for example, air conditioners that just recirculate air rather than bringing in fresh air from outside. And then the question arises quite often, what about contaminated surfaces? Initially, we assumed that surfaces were a pretty significant way of transmitting the virus. But things have changed since then. A lot of publications have appeared where experiments in laboratories were conducted on the survival rate of the virus on different types of surfaces. Some of these surfaces are solid, others are more porous surfaces. But what was really important about all these studies is that they are conducted under very controlled conditions, such as specific temperatures, specific relative humidities. In one instance, even light was removed from the experiment to try and take away another variable from the actual experiment itself. What is also common about these trials is that very high loads of virus are added to those surfaces prior to the actual trial being conducted, or at the beginning of the trial being conducted. So it's very, very difficult to take these results, which differ from each other, by the way, and to translate them to real life situations where relative humidity changes during the day, temperatures fluctuate. And we don't believe that these high levels of viruses that were added to these surfaces for these experiments reflects a real life situation. So we have to ask the question, what is the significance of these results on a real life situation? And including, of course, the viral load that is needed to actually cause infection, which we don't know currently what it is. Furthermore, in May last year, so McKinsey in 2020 last year came out with a report in which they also showed that around 10% of transmission was actually via the environment. And under the term environment, they included surfaces. So here was already an indication that surfaces don't seem to play that much of a role when it comes to transmission of the virus. In July 2020, there was an opinion that was published in the Lancet by Emmanuel Goldman, in which he specifically questions the fact that maybe we are exaggerating the risk of transmission of COVID by fomites. Fomites, of course, meaning inanimate objects like surfaces. And then in February this year, Diane Lewis in Nature published an opinion piece entitled COVID-19 Rarely Infects Through Surfaces. So why are we still deep cleaning? All very good questions. And then as recently as the 5th of April, a couple of weeks ago, the CDC in America have updated their guidance on cleaning and disinfecting your home, in which they say the following, and I'm highlighting that particular paragraph: cleaning with a household cleaner that contains soap or detergent reduces the amount of germs on surfaces and decreases risk of infection from surfaces. That's a general statement. And then they go on to say, in most situations, cleaning alone removes most virus particles on surfaces. And most importantly, disinfection to reduce transmission of COVID-19 at home is likely not needed. So here was another form of admission that in fact it's not necessary to consistently disinfect your surfaces in your home environment, as it's not really needed. Unless, of course, if you've had a family member or a visitor that is COVID-19 positive, then it's a totally different situation. But under normal circumstances, it is not needed to go around and constantly disinfect. Cleaning with a good detergent is more than adequate. So what about high-touch surfaces in the food industry? Well, we do acknowledge that those are important because you might be sitting with hundreds of workers that will be touching constantly these different surfaces. And then, of course, they have to go on to touch their eyes, their noses, their mouths to self-infect in order to actually get infected. And nevertheless, we still do not believe that this is a primary route of infection. And besides the CDC in the US, there are many other organizations that support this, including our position paper, the ICMSF, where we published this position paper last year in September 2020. You can also get that from the website. And we are very clear in that regard, and nothing has changed. Furthermore, myself and Professor Jeff Farber, who addressed you 2 days ago, and some other colleagues, we put together a review on SARS-CoV-2 and risk to food safety, which was published in the Frontiers Journal, which is open access, which you can download for free. So regarding food, what is the issue? Well, on the 13th of August in 2020, China put out a report that they had found COVID-19 on frozen chicken imported from Brazil. And they said there it was positive for COVID-19, and I put it in inverted commas. Furthermore, in 2021, this year in January, it was found in ice cream samples where they looked for SARS-CoV-2, and these ice cream samples tested positive. And recalls were conducted, and the company's 1,662 employees were placed under quarantine. And of course, it resulted in restriction of trade. And what is really important here is to note that in these cases, RNA was detected, not the intact virus. And detecting RNA does not automatically translate into the presence of the intact virus, which is needed, as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, to actually cause disease, because we need those protein spikes to identify the ACE2 receptors on the respiratory cells. Let's move on. So we have to ask the question, therefore, can infected food handlers affect food? Can they contaminate food? And the answer, of course, has to be yes. Hopefully, these would be mainly asymptomatic people, because symptomatic people in a food plant would likely have been identified and put in isolation or in quarantine for the requisite number of days. So these asymptomatic carriers still remain a potential problem in this regard. So let's take a step back. Even if food is contaminated with the virus, viruses cannot grow in or on food or on surfaces. They need a living host in which to replicate and multiply and make more virus. So virus load on a food or on a package would likely get less, but would not increase. The virus is also killed by cooking at 63 degrees Celsius for 4 minutes, or at 60 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes, according to the Food Standards Agency in the UK. We also are not surprised that the virus can survive freezing, because we store viruses at ultra-low freezing temperatures, because we know that they retain their activity if they are stored at those low temperatures. Many questions have been asked around infection via the gastrointestinal tract, because the GI tract also contains cells with ACE2 receptors. However, if the virus, or when the virus lands in the stomach, there is limited survival because of the acidic gastric juices, which would break down a vast portion of the virus. Therefore, the amount of virus in food is also unlikely to be high. And it would be less available, therefore, to the host cells in the GI tract. So we don't believe that this is a likely route of primary infection. In fact, diarrhea, which is one of the many symptoms that have been logged for COVID-19, is more likely due to an infiltration of the virus from the respiratory tract to other organs in the body. So it moves from the respiratory tract to kidneys, to the liver, and for that matter, to the gastrointestinal tract, where it could then cause diarrhea. And we also have no cases that have been reported of fecal-oral transmission of doubt that consumers should know about food safety and COVID-19. And the very first one they have is that currently there is no evidence that the new coronavirus that causes COVID-19 can be transmitted by food. And lastly, food packaging. What is the situation related to that? Well, on the 11th of August last year, again, China reported that they found the virus on outer food packaging. And in this case, RNA was detected, not the intact virus. A similar report on the 28th of September 2020. And unfortunately, in this case, there was a conclusion made which is not based on evidence. It says here that repeated detection of coronavirus in imported cold chain foods, proving that imported cold chain foods are indeed at risk of contamination. Yes, they are likely at risk of contamination from various sources, but it's not translating automatically in transferring the virus from the packaging to humans and causing COVID-19. And then on the 19th of October, for the first time, live virus was reportedly isolated from certain frozen food packages in China. But in this case, the CDC, and here I mean the CDC in China, did not say whether the outbreak was caused by the frozen food packaging. They didn't go so far as to link any dock workers that handled those packages to actual infections. And then in New Zealand also ruled out the possibility that one of its first infections happened at a cold storage facility. And the outcome of this was that China had suspended frozen food imports from companies across at least 19 countries and regions. One must ask, is this a useful policy? Because there is no evidence that live virus present on food or food packaging in high enough numbers is there and can actually then be transferred through self-infection. We need to ask and be clear as to whether we are testing for RNA or live virus. We don't know yet what the viral load is needed to cause illness, and viruses present on food or food packaging lose viability over time. And furthermore, if frozen foods were so efficient in spreading the virus to humans, globally, we would see hundreds of thousands of cases linked to this transmission route, which is not the case. And therefore, there is a great possibility that those workers in this particular case in China were already infected with the virus and then transferred the virus to the food packaging during the handling process. Furthermore, the CDC said that from a total of 2.98 million samples of food packaging, only 22 samples tested positive for RNA. And if we take that as a percentage, it's 0.00073% of positive identification of only RNA. And therefore, what is the risk? Highly unlikely to be a risk. The FDA underscored this on the 18th of February 2021 by saying that the current epidemiological and scientific information indicates that there is no transmission of COVID-19 through food or food packaging. So the big four remain important, of course: physical distancing, masking, and having a good mask management protocol in your business if you're in the food business, washing hands frequently and in the correct way for 20 seconds as a minimum, and avoiding crowded rooms where you can actually create super spreading events. And we've had a few of those already in South Africa. So in conclusion with my concluding remarks, there is no credible evidence of SARS-CoV-2 transmission via food. It is not regarded as foodborne, as are norovirus or hepatitis A. Food recalls are deemed unnecessary. And for a country like mine and many other developing countries, food security is a huge problem. And in particular during COVID-19, when so many people, millions of people have lost their jobs and do not have income to purchase food, we have to ask the question, why are we destroying perfectly safe food for human consumption under these circumstances. It is highly unlikely that the food packaging is a significant transmission route, and testing for viral RNA versus the presence of infectious virus is what we should be asking. The greatest risk is therefore transmission from person to person, and this is therefore primarily an occupational health and safety matter and not a food safety matter. And with that, I thank you very much and thank you for persevering with all the technological issues. And you are welcome to follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter as well as Facebook. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Donnelly, for your excellent presentation. Continuing the topic of the webinar on food and COVID-19, we have now Dr. Bernadette Franco. Dr. Bernadette Franco was a CMS member from 2000 to 2015, and now ICMSF consultant since 2016. She is professor at University of São Paulo, Department of Food and Experimental Nutrition, where she performed teaching, undergraduate and graduate, research and extension activities in the area of food microbiology, food safety, and food hygiene. He is the director of the Food Research Center of University of São Paulo. The title of the talk is Impact of COVID-19 on International Food Trade in Latin America. Please, Dr. Bernadette Franco, you can start.
Well, I would like to start my presentation saying that's really flattering to be one of the presenters of this outstanding webinar. My presentation will be very short, and soon you will find out why. When the Latin American Subcommission of the ICMSF was preparing the program of this session, of this webinar, we thought it would be interesting to talk about how the misunderstandings in relation to foods as vehicles of SARS-CoV-2 are impacting the international food trade in our region. Dr. Lucia Anilich has already mentioned several misinformation about this. This topic is important because Latin America and the Caribbean account for a significant part of the global agricultural production, and the region accounts for 23% of the exports of agricultural and fisheries commodities. So, as already was presented brilliantly by Dr. Lucia Anilich, we know that transmission of COVID-19 can occur in two ways. The direct transmission that occurs by droplets or aerosols expelled by a person infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus that reach other persons. This is by far the most important way of transmission of the disease. However, there is the indirect transmission that occurs when the droplets or aerosols float in the air or land on surfaces or on the hands or parts of the body of other persons. When somebody inhales the contaminated air or touches a contaminated surfaces, the virus can be transferred to the nose, mouth, and eyes, and to other surfaces. As already said, the world has now almost 140 million cases and 3 million deaths. Even with these high numbers, there is absolutely no evidence that would support transmission of this virus by foods, as also occurred with other pandemics caused by similar coronavirus, as already mentioned. However, there have been some reports on detection of RNA of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in some types of frozen foods and food packaging, as already explained by Dr. Lucia, raising the hypothesis that foods or food packaging could be vehicles of this virus. Again, it must be highlighted, though, that the analytical method was PCR, which detects genetic material only, and not the complete and potentially infectious virus. Well, these results are not a surprise, considering that an infected person can contaminate any surface. And this includes the external part of a food or its packaging during any step of the food chain. In addition, there are also some results indicating the possibility of the SARS-CoV-2 reaching the human gastrointestinal tract due to the capability of this virus to cause a serious systemic infection in the human body. With this, the virus can be excreted in the feces, and when the hygiene conditions are poor or fecal contamination happens, there is the possibility of the virus to end up in a food. However, there have been no cases that could be associated to this way of transmission. So the question is, can contaminated food pose a risk for the consumer? I put the words contaminated foods in quotation marks because we are talking about foods with a positive results in the PCR test, which doesn't mean that the virus is there or is infectious. The importance of food as potential risk of causing COVID-19 has to be evaluated in two different ways. We can talk about the risks for workers in the food chain, and we can talk about the risks for the people ingesting food or touching food surfaces. These are two very different situations. Let's start with the first situation, the risks for workers in the food chain. Since the early days of the pandemics, the WHO has been publishing and republishing a number of recommendations to prevent the spread of the disease. Also, authorities in most countries established different types of regulations, guidelines, with different degrees of stringency with the same objective. In this slide, I'm showing a list of the most important regulations in some Latin American countries. I know that this list is incomplete, and I apologize for this. I want to highlight the example of Brazil, because to my knowledge, this was the first time in recent history that three ministries come together and work together and published a joint regulation, this so-called Portaria Conjunta 19/2020, by the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Food Supply, the Ministry of Health, and also the Ministry of Economy. These regulations at governmental level were set in parallel with several other initiatives at all levels of the food production chain. All of them were based in instructions provided by international and local organizations such as WHO, PAHO, EFSA, CDC, ICA, and many others, and also on opinions of experts. These instructions were mostly related to good hygiene practices at manufacturing, packaging, storing, delivering, handling, cooking, etc. Unfortunately, this area has become a fertile field for pseudo-experts, and the world was flooded with misinformation and the so-called fake news, which was an additional burden for the society. At the production level, mainly the industry, the new instructions reinforced existing protocols and recommendations, but introduced new ones, some of them listed here, such as the mandatory use of personal protective equipment, the increased distance between workers in a food plant, the use of UV light for environmental disinfection, intensive environmental monitoring, constant air renewal, zoning, and single traffic lanes, and also testing workers for COVID-19 and the segregation of suspected and confirmed case, and also increased support to workers and their households. I'm sure Dr. John Donnelly will give more details about this in the next talk. In Brazil, they already mentioned Portaria Conjunta 19/2020, established several rigorous requirements for abattoirs, meat processing plants, and the dairy industry. As I mentioned before, other countries in Latin America, such as Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Venezuela, did a similar move, while in others, the guidelines were more generic, applicable to all businesses, not only to the food sector. Well, let's move to the second situation, risks of contracting COVID-19 for people ingesting food or touching food surfaces. As already explained in the previous talk of Dr. Lucia Anelich, contamination of food with the coronavirus is possible, but it's unlikely that a contaminated food will cause disease. We know why. We know why. A food is not a proper environment for the virus, as it needs human cells for adherence and internalization, and it depends on a very complex biochemical machinery of human cells for multiplication of its genome. There is a number of very serious publications on this, and I've listed 3 here. 2 of them were already mentioned by Dr. Anelich, and also we did a publication in Portuguese listed here to help the Brazilian food industry. There are some facts that need to be taken into account when we talk about transmission of COVID-19 by foods. Again, as Dr. Anelich has already explained, one of the facts that is a problem is that SARS-CoV-2 is not affected by the low temperature and survives, among quotation quotes, on surfaces for some time. Additionally, we know that some countries experienced COVID-19 clusters in food businesses. I will present only one example that occurred in the western part of the state of Santa Catarina in the south of Brazil, known as the largest poultry production area in the country, or maybe even in the world. In Chapecó and Concordia, 2 cities in this area, shown in this map, a significant part of the population of these 2 cities contracted COVID-19. This occurred because the majority of the populations of these cities are associated to the poultry businesses. This business is characterized by high density of workers in the processing plants, which is a factor that facilitates the transmission of the virus. Social distancing is a challenge in this environment. Another fact that cannot be ignored and was already mentioned is that there were some reports on detection of viral RNA in some foods or in packages of foods. I have some examples here, and all have in common one important detail. The positivity was for genetic material, as the testing method was PCR and not for the virus. In the last example, the frozen codfish case, it was reported that live virus, again live in quotation marks, was detected on the package, but it was never clarified what does live virus mean and what were the detected numbers. Based on these results, some countries set additional safety requirements for imported food products, such as tests, inspections, and certificates, raising questionable trade barriers. Now we arrive to the tricky question that originated this talk. Are these facts and these new requirements really affecting the international food trade in Latin America? Well, this is a very simple question, but the answer is very difficult. First, because all information on this pandemic is dynamic, and numbers that are valid today may change tomorrow. And second, the big challenge is that I am a food microbiologist and not an economist. So I had some trouble to interpret the immense literature that I found on this topic. Well, after some search and help of some very special friends, who I thank, I ended up with some interesting figures and conclusions that I want to share with you. Before the pandemic, the Latin American and the Caribbean region was expected to become the world's largest food producer in the coming years. It was estimated that the region would contribute with 28% of agriculture and fisheries products, becoming the world's largest food exporting region. My search indicated that this prediction does not seem to be affected by COVID-19. According to the most recent report of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Nations, dated back in August 2020, products related to agriculture and fisheries have grown by 6%, 5.8 to be more precise, in relation to the same period in 2019. This figure becomes crucial when we see that the other goods exported by the region show a 21% fall. And this fall is mainly attributed to losses in manufacturing, mining, and fuel, which resulted in a loss of productive capacity and a process of refocusing the export basket. This slide here has a lot of information on food exports, but you can see in red the products or types of products that were affected negatively, and in green, those that presented growth in the mentioned time window. So January, June 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. I adapted this table from a huge chart published by the Economic Commission for the Latin America and the Caribbean, which was prepared on figures that came from Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and El Salvador. You can see that some agro-industrial products stand out, such as oils, fats, seeds, particularly soy, sugar, and confectionery. On the other hand, export of live animals, fruits, and vegetables have been the most affected sectors. The numbers indicate that the most vulnerable products, the live animals, fruits, and vegetables, are the more labor-intensive and have a short shelf life, while those that stand out, oils, fats, sugar, and confectionery, are nutritionally compromised products. These shifts are detrimental to the availability of healthier food for the population. The obvious question now is, can these variations be attributed to SARS-CoV-2 in foods? The answer to this question is difficult. The majority of available information is related to food insecurity and to the vulnerability of the food system during the pandemic at a global level. It's more than clear that the international trade of foods is affected by the economic crisis derived from the pandemic and some other additional factors, and not by contamination of foods or food packaging with coronavirus. What could be these additional factors? First, shifts in consumer demands are certainly a relevant factor, but these factors were already in place well before the COVID-19 pandemic started. It is well known that the demand for plant-based foods replacing animal protein or for less processed foods is increasing rapidly, forcing a reshaping of the food industry, food business as a whole. Other factor is that the pandemic has brought unprecedented stresses to the food supply chain, and food production has been disrupted by labor shortages, shutdowns, with several bottlenecks in farm labor, processing, transport, and logistics. And what about the trade barriers I have cited before, related to foods or food packaging as vehicles of coronavirus? Well, I can tell you that I saw light at the end of the tunnel. In the last meeting of the Committee on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures of the World Trade Organization, that happened just 3 weeks ago, some delegates raised their concerns about the requirements for testing and certification and about restrictions imposed by some countries for imported foods. Well, the committee agreed to continue the discussion and asked members with such measures to provide data, studies, and risk assessments that would explain them as valid or proportionate. A future meeting is scheduled for July 21, and so that new outcomes on this issue can be expected. And with this last slide, I finished my presentation, thanking the audience for hearing me and the Latin American Subcommission of ICMSF for organizing this wonderful webinar. I also thank our sponsors, and a special thanks goes to those working in the combat of the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite their efforts, this deadly disease took away the life of Ricardo Sobol, our big friend and president of the Latin American Subcommission of ICMSF. We are missing him so much. Well, thank you again for your attention, and I hope to be able to answer questions you may have at the end of this session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernadette Franco, for your excellent and emotive presentation. The last speaker of the webinar is Dr. John Donnelly. Hello, John. Dr. John Donnelly is ICMSF member since 2015. He is head of food safety at corporate quality at Nestle in Switzerland, and current responsibilities include global operational aspects of food safety microbiology, aging, allergen, and other prerequisite programs across factories and multiple food categories. He worked for many years as project leader in food safety microbiology at Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute, Ireland. Thank you, Dr. Donnelly, for talking part in this webinar for the third time. Today, Dr. Donnelly, we talk about food and COVID-19, a food industry view. Please, Dr. Donnelly, you can start.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I know we were slightly ahead of time, so I will go slowly so that if people are just joining specifically for my talk, they can catch up. But also a big thank you to Lucia and Bernadette, the previous speakers, for really setting the scene for my presentation, because I think they really captured a lot of the key points in a very, very difficult topic, and a topic that has now been running for 15 months. And they gave a lot of the sort of the pertinent facts. And I think that's important, is that we actually speak about what science, true, robust science, is available around this topic. So what I intend to do today is take you on a journey of, let's say, a large food manufacturer, a global manufacturer like Nestle, and how we have actually navigated COVID-19 through this last 15 months. And remember, when this starts in January of 2020, little or nothing was known about this. And so a lot of the food industry and a lot of society in general were reacting to a lot of less information available than we have today. So, if you bear that in mind as you listen to my presentation. And as I say, although I will talk about it from a large multinational perspective. A company like Nestle, who operates in 80 countries with 80 manufacturing countries where we have manufacturing sites, with sort of selling in over 180 countries as well worldwide. I think some of the lessons and some of the things that I will mention will resonate with any size of food manufacturing industry. So hopefully you will take some bits from this and sort of appreciate some of the challenges that we've had to go through as a food manufacturer. But I would point out really from the outset as well, when this pandemic, or even before it was known as a pandemic or acknowledged as a pandemic, we had two main missions within Nestle, and that was the protection of the health and safety of our workers, of our operatives and all of the people in the organization, as well as the surrounding communities and society. And secondly, was ensuring business continuity. Because you remember, probably the food industry, second only to the healthcare workers, was one of the essential, let's say, industries. People still had to eat. They may have changed their eating habits in terms of not eating out of home. They still had to eat. And that really was a big influencing factor in terms of how food manufacturers had to continue their business. So this slide demonstrates, let's say, maybe the complexity of a farm to fork continuum in terms of food production. And every one of you listening will be well aware of the complexities and the interdependencies that operates right through from farm, and our suppliers, our primary processors, right through to the consumers who consume the product, with all of the manufacturing in between. All of these are interoperable and they all have interdependencies. So COVID-19 did not affect any one aspect in particular. It impacted all of these aspects, and an impact in one aspect ultimately led to pressures on the next. But overall, I would say we, in the COVID pandemic, we had two, let's say, opposing pressures. On one hand, we had the pull from consumer demand. You remember, lockdown was occurring. People were forced to stay at home. There was panic buying. People were stocking up pantries, stocking up freezers. So there was almost a larger than ever spike in the demand for food. And contrary to that, we had this resource availability. People were becoming sick. People were self-isolating because of contact tracing, or they had contact with someone. There was farms not able to employ enough people to harvest their crops. There was suppliers who were not able to get enough people to do primary processing, and factories were short of personnel as well. So with these two opposing pressures to make sure the food chain operated as normal and people were still able to have their food. But on top of all of that, I call it two overarching pressures, and one was license to operate. And what I mean by license to operate, if you're operating in 80 countries, you can imagine the different regulations, the different regimes, the different policies and strategies that each of those countries had in terms of how they approach the management of SARS-CoV-2 or the pandemic, in terms of contact tracing, in terms of travel, in terms of movement of people, in terms of movement of goods, etc. And Bernadette touched a little bit on that previously, and I will mention that at the end of this slide. Secondly, there was what I call the infodemic, and Lucia has done a really great job in her presentation of condensing that information as much as we possibly can. Because remember, in January last year, if I did a Google search on the 1st of January last year for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID virus, I would probably find just a handful of publications. By something like July or August, you do a quick Google search, and this was in the hundreds of thousands in Google. Now, how is someone who's trying to operate a food business and so much uncertainty, and even society and governments in general, to be able to operate in such a disruptive information scenario? So as a food manufacturer, obviously we were in the same situation. So this is the one lesson learned is know where your reliable sources of data and information are. This is key. And as Bernadette alluded to, yeah, it was a sort of a perfect scenario for lots of fake news and sort of false information or unvalidated information, let's say. So this is what the general context that we were trying to live within or operate within. So what I want to try to do now is take you through each of the elements of the value chain, starting from like suppliers and packaging right through to the consumer, and discuss some of the practicalities and some of the practical issues we had to deal with during this pandemic in terms of a food manufacturing perspective. Firstly, we like to start with, like, let's say, suppliers, and that is suppliers of ingredients and suppliers of packaging. The immediate thing that rose to the surface was shortage of supplies. You remember in large food manufacturing organizations, you obviously buy in advance, but suddenly those advance purchases suddenly starts to dry up, and suddenly you start to have to search for new materials. We saw very quickly that some materials were just not available, and so then this meant we had to adjust recipes. This had consequences in terms of being flexible and how flexible we are. And also in some cases, you end up having this as an impact on the labeling of those products. You imagine if you have labeling already printed for the next 6 months, and then suddenly some of those ingredients that you have in your label are no longer available, what do you do? So this is a sort of a typical scenario that you had to face. And luckily, many of the regulatory authorities actually allowed some flexibility within this sort of labeling context, to cope with this shortage of supply. But again, it was something that really had to be dealt with right at the outset because of the shortage of supply. Also, as you have to source new materials, of course, ultimately the food that you sell has to be safe and has to be wholesome and has to be of high quality. So here, the safety parameters that are non-negotiable, I say, is the likes of microbiological hazards, chemical hazards, allergens, foreign bodies, etc. So in a lot of cases, we had to really look and ensure that the new supplies that we're buying or the new ingredients that we were buying were still of the same quality and met the same and were compliant with the same specifications that we would set for with our, let's say, our previously long-standing trusted suppliers. And then a big factor that came to the fore as well was the prevalence of food fraud or awareness of food fraud, because you can imagine if there's a shortage of supplies, there will be people who will view this as an opportunity to, let's say, adulterate existing supplies with other materials. So we found ourselves having to actually to screen more products, where we viewed there may be a risk of food fraud, and where food fraud would present not only an economic situation, in terms of you don't get what you pay for, but that your fraudulent material could be added to your raw materials, and it could represent, for example, an allergenic hazard. So again, we had to be more vigilant than ever, I would say, with all of the new supplies that we had to change to as part of the contingency. Packaging was another issue. Packaging is a raw material, let's say, and in some cases, there were shortages of certain packages. So in a lot of cases, we had to negotiate and discuss with our suppliers where they had to sort of like swap the resins that were in the packaging, because again, the risk of packaging is a migration of chemicals from packaging to foods, which can present a hazard. And so we don't want to end up sourcing new packaging, which presents a chemical hazard risk. So again, a lot of involvement in risk assessment of onboarding of new suppliers or taking on new types of packaging. Then there was the aspect, and Lucia spelt it out very, very nicely. And this was around, is there a risk to packaging? And remember, if you think back to March, April, May, 1 year ago, at this stage, there was little or no information available on the survival of the virus, for example, on packaging. So, we were sourcing packaging material, and packaging of equipment, whatever was coming from what we viewed as epicenters of the virus at that stage. And even among workers, there was a certain anxiety because there was not the information available that Lucia has mentioned now about. We know that you can find RNA possibly on a packaging, but as a food safety risk or a packaging risk of infection, this is highly unlikely. So, but at that particular time, we had to deal with this sort of, like, say, anxiety around, is it a risk or is it not a risk? One of the other aspects in terms of supply chain that we had to cope with was around transport or container truck shortage. And again, here, you might say, well, does that affect me? Remember, the transport and logistic industry is a very fragile industry. I think, as you will know from the recent, one ship gets blocked in the Suez Canal with lots of containers on it, with a whole backlog behind it, and suddenly there's a shortage of various commodities, and that was just a ship gets blocked, for a number of days. At the time of the pandemic, a lot of the container trucks had actually been shipped out from areas such as Asia and were in other parts of the world. And in the shipping industry, there is different classes of containers, those that are food grade, others that are not food grade. So there was a shortage of food grade containers in certain parts of the world because the containers were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then suddenly there was, I want to transport food from one part of the world to another part of the world, and suddenly the containers are not available. How can I approve a container that is a non-food grade container to transport food? Again, just to highlight a typical challenge that we had to deal with. The next aspect around suppliers is onboarding of new suppliers. A company like Nestle will have tens of thousands of suppliers, but some of these suppliers were not able to deliver, as I mentioned before, because of the resource issue. And in many cases, you had to onboard new suppliers at very short notice. In normal circumstances, this would involve getting the background from the company, doing an audit with respect to food safety management systems, looking at what control measures they have in place, etc., looking at their manufacturing process, etc. But because of the travel restrictions, these audits were, in a lot of cases, not possible. So it ended up, we had to resort to the use of remote auditing. And again, you will see now this is almost becoming a common practice of having to do these remote auditings. So that's using digital tools to be able to sort of assess the processes and assess the paperwork and assess the practices that your supplier may actually have in place. But this itself may not give you enough confidence. And so to try to ensure that you're as comfortable as you can be with the supplies that you're taking in, you might decide, and what we decided in some cases was to increase the amount of analytical testing. And I know this might be in contrary to what you heard me saying on previous days. You don't assure food safety by endpoint testing. And in the same way, you don't assure food safety of your raw materials by increasing testing, because it relies on a lot of verification process like audit, etc. And trust in building up a historical data from that supplier. But in these cases where you have severe shortages of supplies and you have to onboard suppliers through remote auditing, for example, then another means of strengthening your confidence is to actually increase the analytical verification through your micro, your chemical, your foreign body testing, your allergen testing, etc. So we did, in some cases, have to increase the amount of testing we did just to try to reinforce or enhance our analytical verification. Then if we come to a topic that Lucia has mentioned about cleaning, sanitation, or cleaning and disinfection, again, I'm now talking about historically. Remember, at the very beginning, there was a lot of controversy about which cleaning chemicals worked. Do they work on an envelope virus? Do they not? Can you extrapolate from SARS and MERS information that was available at that particular time? What's on the EPA list? What chemicals are recommended? And even then, because everybody was enhancing their hand sanitation and cleaning of high touch points. There was even a shortage of some of these chemical agents because the chemical suppliers and suppliers of these disinfectants, detergents and sanitizers were not prepared for this either. And so at one point, even the WHO, you might recall, issued a formula for the preparation of hand sanitizer. So you could customize the preparation of hand sanitizing. And now I'll come back to where that created a shortage as well later. So this was an issue we had to deal with as well. What if there's a shortage of cleaning agents for your manufacturing environment? Then the second point here is questioning alternate solutions for disinfection. The arrival of the COVID pandemic really created an ideal scenario for those people wanting to push alternative cleaning, sanitation, disinfection regimes. And I've no problem with that whatsoever, provided those have some form of validation and are shown to be effective against whatever pathogen you want it to be effective against, and in this case, COVID-19. But in a lot of cases, we saw solutions being put forward, which, to be honest, presented an occupational risk. So in some cases, the cure was actually worse than the actual disease. And in these cases, we had to be very robust with trying to assure that whatever alternate disinfection, sanitation, killing agents that we wanted to use, were they effective or not? And Bernadette alluded to a few of those in her talk. Some of them do work, some of them work but have not validation data. Some of them do not work and have no validation data. Some of them just present an occupational risk, which should not be used. So this is really where you have to be careful. It's easy to buy into the situation that I need something badly, and really I take it on board. I personally had to stop a number of interactions like this in a number of our factories in a number of different countries because I wasn't satisfied with the solution being offered. So again, go back to your trusted suppliers, just like for your raw materials, go to your trusted suppliers with regards to disinfectants, detergents, or sanitizing agents. And I mentioned, then we go to laboratory consumables. In Nestle, we do 95% of our testing in our own laboratories. So we have a large laboratory infrastructure. And here we even saw some disruption because of supply shortages. I mentioned before about hand sanitizers and chemicals shortages. These are the same chemicals that can be used for a lot of your chemical analysis. If I take something like, the alcohols that are used, for example, to prepare hand sanitizers, for example, these are the same things that are quite often used in HPLC. So, again, we're having to deal in some cases with shortages of some chemicals that were actually commonly used in our laboratories, even down to the point where even we saw in some cases, plastics. There was a diversion of a lot of plastics and a lot of PCR-based consumables and lateral flow device-based consumables, to COVID testing. Can you imagine the amount of testing that is done now for COVID versus what was done previously? So this immediately, diverted a lot of these sort of laboratory supplies to some of these healthcare settings where a lot of COVID testing was being done. This is all ironed itself out now because eventually, the suppliers of these materials ramp up their supply. But at the beginning, just like with the chemicals, this sort of a shortage of some of these commodities really, had an impact on even things like our laboratories and in our cleaning in our factories. So then I want to move to, let's say, what did we do in terms of our manufacturing? And I think Bernadette alluded to this in her talk quite a bit. And I think everybody is now pretty well aware of very many of the preventative measures that have been put in place. And in essence, it followed the hierarchy of controls, which you will see on the likes of the CDC sites, etc. And sort of the different types of levels of control that we can put in place. Really, from the beginning, of course, we reinforced medical self-reporting because we have this in place in our factories anyway. Anyone who is feeling ill, or has any, conditions that may impact food safety, they're advised to stay at home. They're advised to report. we reinforced this immediately, that anyone could actually report and then stay at home. Also, we actually had in some countries, the governments, had a stay-at-home policy for certain members of the community, who were suffering from other illnesses that make them more vulnerable, etc. So these were some of the things which we had to really enhance within our factories. Contact tracing, not only for our employees, but also for our visitors. And this was one of the things which really, at the very, very beginning, we became very conscious of very quickly. Initially, we had a lot of contact tracing. You had to report who you've been in contact, stay at home, etc., for our own employees. But very quickly, you realize you have a lot of other third parties who come into your factories, like your pest contractors, like maybe a cleaning contractor, maintenance technicians, even visitors to the factory. So very quickly realized these people still have to be under our control in terms of contact tracing, reporting illness, etc. And obviously then, we also introduced the temperature monitoring devices, digital or otherwise, of monitoring devices, and in some cases introduced personal analytical testing. So lateral flow testing of all employees was put in place for some of our factories as well. Then, as just has been mentioned, enhanced hand and high contact surface sanitation. So clearly, obviously in all food manufacturing plants, you will have a very robust routines of entry in terms of uniform, hairnet, beard snoots, and hand washing and sanitation before entry to production. This was really, really further enforced and highlighted to all the employees. And then obviously all the personal hygiene and etiquette reinforcements were put in place as well. And I will talk a little bit detail now on social distancing and also on face masks, because these were two, let's say, very, in some ways, sensitive topics, but where we sort of learned some lessons as well. One point I would point out to you, and although we have talked about surfaces not being the highest means of transmission and fomites not being the one of the top causes, it's primarily person to person and aerosolization. But we also worked within our R&D organization. We were doing a lot of work on the topics that Lucia had just mentioned. And one of the topics we actually looked at was actually, could we coat surfaces that are high touch surfaces that actually could eliminate the coronavirus? And we worked with and we assessed a number of different companies who were providing different solutions, from films to sprays, silver-based, quaternary ammonium salts-based, copper-based, etc. And through the work that we did there with the real virus, I would point out, with SARS-CoV-2 and some of its surrogates, we actually now we are using a film known as NanoShield to coat some of our out-of-home coffee machines. So this is where machines that, we still will have our hands cleaning, but, here you have regular people coming and touching buttons all of the time, so this is an added measure. We don't say it's a silver bullet, but it is an added measure. And we have shown in real circumstances that this does maintain its COVID SARS-2 inactivation capabilities, even with something like 200 to 300 washes and cleaning. So this does retain its activity. So that's just something, by the way, that we have been working on. I'd now like to talk a little bit about social distancing. And immediately this was one of the things to prevent the person-to-person transmission, is we had the discussions around 2 meters, 1 meter, etc. apart. And I think one of the big things that we learned very quickly is social distancing is not just about manufacturing, in the manufacturing site. For example, we have some sites that the workers live together in dormitories. They travel by bus. They come all together at check-in. Then they go to their locker rooms, and then they go to the plant, and then they go to the canteen. Social distancing, to prevent the community, disease in the community entering to food manufacturing situations, must take place everywhere. And in some cases, we were actually putting on maybe 4 to 5 times more buses, to take the people to the manufacturing plant, just so that we could ensure social distancing. And again, at check check-in, we had very one time. And again, in locker rooms, we had the segregation. And you can see by the picture here, typically that what you see in a typical manufacturing setting, you'll see where distancing was not possible, then you introduced extra PPE. So you had your face masks, you had your face shields, and you also had physical barriers between each of the people. And you can see also in the canteens the types of physical barriers which, you know, we now see everywhere, let's say, in a lot of cases. So, you know, this is what we had to put in place. This probably took place about 2/3 of the way through last year, where we had to start to do this. Then I come to masks, and masks can be a bit of a hot topic, you know, and again, I'll take you through here the journey of masks. And remember, at the very, very beginning, there was a big question: do you need to wear masks or not? And you remember even the WHO were advising at that stage around whether masks were actually, useful or not in terms of protecting source contamination. And there was a lot of discussion around that. And also at the beginning, remember, there was a severe shortage of masks, and the question was, does a food manufacturing plant ask their employees and operatives to wear masks when the local health sector don't have enough masks for their health workers? So there is an ethical issue around this as well. And this was when there was a shortage of masks, remember. And then when masks started to become more and more available, then it was clear that yes, and mask wearing was advocated through the WHO and many other organizations. Then there came the issue, well, how does your mask perform? And is there any certification around masks? And then some certifications became known, for example, AFNOR, and in EU, there were some regulations around PPE regulations. And so some norms became into the scenario as well. So then you got the situation, is the mask that I'm now wearing, is it good enough to protect me, protect others? Do I want a mask that protects myself as well? So there's a discussion around surgical masks versus N95 masks, KN95 masks, disposable masks versus reusable masks. Because again, surgical masks that are disposable can also generate a lot of waste. So again, a lot of discussion around this. And then, as Lucia has mentioned, we had to introduce a lot of training around how people actually wear the mask. But some of the biggest risks are that people put on a mask and then they start to shuffle the mask on their face, or they take it off, they put it down below their jaw, etc., etc. And really here, this touching of the mask, and if it's contaminated, and then touching your eyes or touching surface, you have to have proper protocols for this as well. So again, we had to introduce a lot of training about what type of mask we should wear in a manufacturing environment, how they should be donned, and then how long they should actually be worn for. And then, even now we still have questions. If we go to surgical masks, how long will a surgical mask last? If I go to KN95s or an N95, how many times can I use it? How many days can I use it for? Or is it a disposable mask? Because this comes into, there's an economic element of this as well. If you're buying N95 masks and you dispose of them each day, and you have 1,000 workers in your factory, you're disposing and creating a lot of waste as well. So a lot of discussions and debate around the topic of masks as well. And of course, then you have some environments which have been talked about, like cold rooms, rooms that have no natural ventilation, etc. Is there any occupational risks with regards to these sort of environments? If I go into a mask and I enter a sort of a cold room or a freezer room with wearing a mask, and there's condensation on it and it freezes. Is that an occupational risk? Of course, we have to assess that as well. So, there is many different scenarios appeared, even around the mask wearing situation. One of the other topics which I want to move to is the adaptation, let's say, with respect to digital remote technology. This is, we've all hear a lot about digitalization in the food chain now, and digitalization in food processing. But really, the COVID-19 has really brought on the use of, let's say, remote or digital technology. And this is just to give you an example with these pictures. If you look at the picture on the left-hand side, this is actually me at my table in my apartment in Switzerland on an XM Reality tool, which is linked directly to a factory in the other side of the world. And I can actually advise a person where to take my environmental monitoring samples, for my normal environmental monitoring process. And he, at the other end, can communicate, and I can circle on my screen where I want the sample to be taken, and he can zoom in, zoom out, and have a free conversation live through an XM Reality software. Many people also there's many different platforms available, including Microsoft Teams, but with some of these are better than others, and they allow you to have a real interactive interaction with the people actually on the ground. So this in some ways is it causes sort of a mini sort of mindset change with regards to technical support and expertise supply to some of our factories. I always say machines don't know when there is a COVID outbreak or when there's a pandemic on. They still will break down and they need technical support. So we have been applying this sort of technical assistance tools, augmented reality tools, by our own internal expertise and also with third-party expertise to support our factories. And again, we see the exact same thing being used now with auditing. And you will know some of the stories coming from GFSI, etc., and some of the certification bodies. What is acceptable? Can we do remote auditing, for example, for renewal of your certification in your factories? Can you remote audit suppliers? Then we talk about a hybrid, and everyone talks now about a hybrid. So that's a halfway between a physical audit and an interactive digital audit. So these tools now are really coming to the fore and being applied more and more because of the situation that we find ourselves in with restricted travel, etc. So just in terms of some of the things that we uncovered in terms of food safety and quality verification and some of the, sort of the learning points. And a lot of our factories, we've put in place what we call a COVID champion. And this was a person who's responsible for and overseeing the interaction with the local public health authorities. So they knew what the rules were around reporting of instances, etc., with respect to COVID, and also onboarding of new operatives. Because remember, we had many people that we had to onboard because of the demand for food. And so we had a lot of training to be done as well. And this is what we did not want to compromise food safety, just because we're having to onboard a lot of new people. We had to adjust our environmental sampling plans in some cases because sometimes people were not available to take the samples. And so we had to change the number of samples we had to take. As I mentioned before, we had to do the same for allergen verification for some of the new ingredients that we were sourcing. Also, simple things like sensory panels. Sensory panels means that these are panels that check your product when production, that one batch matches the previous batch, etc. We had it sometimes because people couldn't travel to the factory where the products were being made, and we had to adjust how this was actually done. We also had to adjust for longer production times because of the demand for food. Sometimes the production runs were running for longer. We had to still ensure safety and quality if we were running for longer production times in terms of cleaning, in terms of verification of cleaning, etc. And as I mentioned and was mentioned earlier, environmental monitoring was a big question that came up quite often because we had a lot of suppliers advocating that there was methods available for doing environmental monitoring SARS-CoV-2. And in some publications, this was advocated as appropriate in a manufacturing environment. If in our case, we did not advocate doing environmental monitoring for SARS-CoV-2 because simply we were comfortable in the prerequisite measures that we had in place and the preventative measures that we had in place. And anyhow, if I find RNA in a food surface, what do I do with that result? Do I go chasing which employee may have put it there? And how do I do that? I'd rather spend my money, for example, maybe screening the workers coming in and making sure all of my preventative measures are in place. So again, just some of the things that changed around let's say the supply channels we saw the bottom circle here. This almost disappeared. Eating out disappeared. So that meant people were stocking up on certain products. For example, frozen food, chilled food, things that could be stored in freezers, long shelf life products were really, really increased sales. We actually saw our e-commerce food sales increase by about 50%. So really the way in which we actually were selling our food changed dramatically. And so we had to adjust upstream how those manufacturing schedules and production times and etc. were actually managed. And we also saw products that are health-based, like say nutrition, health science, Nest nutrition products. We saw increased demand for those types of products as well. So again, we had to adjust how we manufactured those and to meet the demand. I mentioned earlier about a license to operate, and this was just to give you a few examples of where we had some challenges. At the very beginning, some countries insisted that vulnerable workers must stay at home. So in this case, the vulnerable workers may have had a sort of an underlying condition. They may have suffered from diabetes. They may have actually been undergoing some form of cancer treatment, etc. in the past, or they had some other underlying condition. In some cases, we saw 50% of our quality team not being allowed to come to work because of this. In other cases, we actually saw different approaches from different countries around contact tracing and how to manage cases in the factory. So again, we had to adapt to very many different local public health rules. In some countries, some of our factories were viewed as non-essential and were asked to shut down. Some countries, a chocolate factory was viewed as a non-essential factory and was asked to shut down. So in some cases, we had people being sent home from some factories, and in other cases, we had staff shortages. So it was a little bit of a dilemma to deal with as well. Also within some countries, we had restricted movements of goods and even samples. In some countries, we had a situation whereby where we were taking our samples as part of environmental monitoring, raw material testing, finished product testing, we could not even send them in the same country to laboratories that were in a different part of the country. They were viewed as those goods were not allowed to be moved, even though they were just for microbiological or allergen or chemical testing. So this was a challenge. We had to find contingency to find new laboratories. And even more recently, and I think this was alluded to by Lucia and Bernadette, we've seen some countries putting in some import requirements, which also put some pressure on us, for example, as well. And in China in particular, as you've heard all the stories about the frozen food and the finding of RNA, and whether then this sort of material, if RNA was found on it, it could be rejected at the border. But in February, China even expanded that further to include import of all products. So overnight, we went from a situation where we thought this does not impact our products to actually having to disinfect all of our transport containers, the insides of our transport containers, and the outer packaging of our goods, and provide a disinfection certificate to ensure that our products could be exported to China. So again, this is an example of what I call the license to operate. So that finishes me, and I think we've heard a lot about the R word, and I would say one thing about the food, about the food chain and food manufacturing is not so much what is the R value, but is how resilient probably the food industry has shown itself to be over the last 15 months. So thank you very much, and I hand you back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Donnelly, for your excellent presentation, very comprehensive. So now we ask Dr. Luciana Lishi, Dr. Bernadette Franco, please open your screens and to take part in this session of a question and discussion. Dr. Bernadette.
I have a message here that the host stopped my video.
Okay. Okay, let's wait just a minute.
That's okay now.
Okay, so you are here. Thank you, all of you, for the excellent presentation. We learned a lot of COVID and flu. So I have a question for Dr. Lucia Donnelly. Due to the pandemic, a lot of people that lost their job are producing and selling meals to complement the family income. How will this initiative impact in the occurrence of outbreaks? And also, how to balance food safety and food security in regions like Latin America, African countries? So how to balance this?
Thank you very much for the question.
So just let us know, Thiago, when we can continue.
Nice message, Thiago, in this.
Yes? Okay, sorry, we had a technical problem, but we're back again. So I'm going to ask again, John, Dr. John Donnelly, how to harmonize the extra cost to maintain the virus out of the food with the lower purchase power of the population.
Okay. Thank you, Marta. Yeah, no, of course, all of the measures that we've had to put in place, have involved a considerable investment, but that's acceptable, and this is what we do, because as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the first priority was to ensure the health and safety of our workers and the communities from which they come from, and the second was to ensure business continuity. And of course, all of this, comes with a cost as well, and that is part of Nestlé's, overall investment. So, it's the idea. Yes, I do appreciate that there will be communities that will have less disposable income, because of they've lost their jobs, etc. In certain communities. And what Nestlé have also done there is actually to make available, let's say, lower volume type packaging, so that the people can still buy the products. They don't have to buy the larger volume or mass products, but can actually purchase, let's say, lower, what we call popularly positioned products, where these come in sort of like a smaller volumes. So they are still affordable, for these sort of communities.
Okay, thank you. Another question, John, is as a consequence of the measures taken in the factories to face illegal aspects, given to control the contamination of the virus, and also as a global consequence of change due to the lack of some products or raw materials, some aspects of the infrastructure process have had to be changed. So should this lead to a revision in the HACCP plan? Without this change?
Yeah, of course, HACCP, as I say, is the basis of all of our food safety, food safety management system, along with the prerequisite programs. And with any HACCP study, we also build in management of change. So if we have to onboard a new ingredient or a new packaging, for example, then we go back to our hazard assessment part of HACCP and say, is there a further risk coming from that material in terms of from a microbiological risk, a chemical risk, for example, if it's packaging, or if it's an allergenic risk, and as part of HACCP, part of the, let's say, a review of the hazard assessment would take place if we're making a dramatic change in new raw materials.
Okay, thank you. Another question for you, John, Dr. Donnelly. Can you tell us the composition of the nanoshield, and does it both prevent attachment, inactivated the virus, the shield, nano shield?
The nano shield is based on copper impregnation. So copper is the active agent, let's say, and so this does cause inactivation. So and this has been put in for publication, so it will be available shortly in a scientific publication. So in that case, it is copper is the active process, let's say, or active means of inactivation. So, and as I say, we've treated it with SARS-CoV-2, and it eliminates, I can't remember the exact log reduction, but I think it's a 5 log reduction, we see in terms of when you immediately put this onto the film. So you put a film on a material, you add your virus to it, and you see immediately a large log reduction. And even if you clean that material with cloths, etc., it still maintains its inactivation efficacy.
Great. Dr. Annelies, one question for you. The understanding of need of more hygiene and care with foods, did it have a positive effect in reducing outbreaks caused by bacteria? So, can you comment on it?
Sorry, could you just repeat the first part of the question?
Yes, because people are being more hygienic. There are several, effort to people take more care with the food. Did it cause any positivity to avoid all the outbreaks caused by bacteria in your country and other countries? Have you seen some positive effects?
Yep. There have been reports of positive effects in terms of lowering food safety. I wouldn't say necessarily outbreaks, but food safety problems and food safety incidents. There have definitely been reports of an improvement because of people staying at home and people practicing more hygiene, and also the higher level of hygiene even in for example, in the retail sector. Just the fact that you walk into a retail store and you can sanitize the trolley and the handles. So there's a lot of that sort of thing that has occurred, which has certainly assisted in preventing transmission of bacteria that can actually cause, and viruses for that matter, that can actually cause proper foodborne disease.
Thank you. So there is some question about the changes in the shelf life of the fresh produce in the supermarket. So was the validation? Do you have some example of this change in the shelf life of the products, especially for fresh products in the supermarket? Did you see something like that, Dr. John Donnelly?
It's not an area that we're in terms of Neste producing fresh produce. So, but I don't see how the impact of COVID would have on looking at the difference in the shelf life in the retail sector. I think one of the issues, as I said before, is more maintaining the supply to the supermarkets. But in terms of the shelf life, will not really, I cannot see how it will be impacted as a result of COVID. Availability is more probably the issue, rather than the actual shelf life.
Okay. So we have the last question for Dr. Donnelly and Dr. Annelies. A number of companies have developed rapid tests for the detection of SARS-CoV-2 in the environment of food plants. Do you think this is sending the wrong message? Who would like to start, Dr. Annelies?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer, of course. I am not a great proponent of testing in food plants for the presence of the virus, because once again, we are testing for RNA, which doesn't necessarily indicate that there is live virus present. Secondly, we are now more sure that surface contamination and that form of transmission is very, very low and is not believed to be a primary mode of transmission. So testing for the presence of the virus, I think, is a cost that is not needed. And then I think also a very important point is that when you do clean and disinfect surfaces in food plants, for example, the current disinfectants that are used are in fact effective against the virus. So testing for efficacy of testing, like doing a swab for a total plate count or for Enterobacteriaceae indicator organisms on surfaces after cleaning, specifically to test for efficacy of cleaning. And I think that is more than enough. I really don't think there is a need to conduct routine testing for the virus on surfaces.
Yes, and Marta, I agree entirely with what Lucia said, and we do not do routine environmental testing for COVID in our environmental surfaces. As Lucia said, we have our normal cleaning sanitation, which we know works against envelope viruses. We do our normal cleaning verification through ATP, testing, swabbing, etc. And as well as that, we have all our preventative measures in place, contact tracing, reporting of illnesses that I mentioned, hand washing, high frequency of high touch points being cleaned, etc. So we do a lot of preventative measures and anyhow and verify those. And anyhow, if we do find RNA from a PCR test in an environmental sample, what do I do with it? I have got RNA that is in my environment. It could be RNA left over from inactivation through cleaning. Does it mean, you might say it tells me that someone in the plant once had COVID, but then what do I do? Do I go then searching all my employees and contractors to find who may have left it there? I'd rather spend my money, to be honest, on screening of my employees coming in if I wanted to test, rather than doing environmental monitoring. But I'm aware there are suppliers out there who are advocating environmental monitoring. But honestly, I am yet to be convinced.
So, thank you very much, our speakers of today, Dr. John Donnelly, Dr. Bernadette Franco, Dr. Lucia Nelich, for the brilliant presentation, very, very comprehensive. And so, we are now reaching the closing session. And there were 3 days of a very productive and rich lecture. We now ask all the Latin America Subcommission Organizing Committee to take part in this closing session. Could you please open the screen? And also Dr. Marcel Swettering, our chairman of the ICMSF, Dr. Leon Boris, the secretary executive of the ICMSF. We also ask Dr. Jeff Faber. We have a pleasure to have him also in this closing session. So please, let's take part in this closing session. This webinar, I just want to give some information that we had the 1,110 visualization access on Tuesday, with 250 people accessing at the same time. Yesterday, we had 890 visualization and 230 at the same time. Today, we had 341 access with 155 visualization. So it was a very good webinar, very successful. And I thank you, everybody. And I would like to ask Dr. Marcel Swettering to give some words. Okay. Dr. Marcel, please.
Thank you very much, but we'll first start with Leon to give him first the floor.
Thank you very much, Marcel. And yes, it's a pleasure for Marcel and me to take part in the closure of this excellent webinar. We also want to make sure we congratulate the organizers and thank the sponsors very much for making this possible. And also appreciate a lot the input of various ICMSF members. As Marcel mentioned at the start of the webinar 2 days ago, ICMSF is a relatively small organization, but we are active and we have gone through a kind of a journey, an evolution, if you like, of food safety management. We were established 60 years ago in 62, and in the beginning we've paid a lot of attention to sampling, testing, devising new methods of how to understand the presence of microorganisms and what microorganisms we were dealing with. We moved gradually to the understanding of microbiological ecology of foods, how we manage food, understanding ecology next to the traits of organisms, and how can we preserve and process foods, which is something we did between the 80s and 2000. And in the last year, we moved to much more thinking about risk-based management, proportional management, and making sure that we understand that our money is where the biggest value is if we think about food safety. And I think also the last day of the COVID debate just resonated very much with that topic that we are now dealing with. So how can we best use our resources? Where is the biggest risk? And then those two need to come together. And for the future, of course, there will be challenges coming. Food security is something that we really need to get better on assuring. Food safety and food security go hand in hand. Now, the Latin America Subcommission, who has been organizing the last 3 days, the webinar, has come along on this journey with the ICMSF at global level. Subcommissions like LAS are very important for ICMSF. We're a small group. We think we are an active group, but the subcommissions really make that even better. They are promoting our activities among the peers, the microbiologists in various regions of the world. There's certainly a lot helping us with communication, not only in translation terms, but also in tailoring messaging, tailoring our concepts so that they're best understood by those that need to. So the subcommissions that we have are a very valuable part of our community. And yes, indeed, translating and communicating the particular books and papers that ICMSF has published, like the ones I showed on the previous slide, is important. But also the expertise coming from the regions, the insights coming from the regions helps us to tailor how we develop concepts, how we message about concepts, and how we go further in our evolution. And that is very much appreciated. The Commission is 60 years old. The Latin America Subcommission is also 54 years old. So the Commission and the Latin America Subcommission have worked together for a long time. And we are so happy that the LAS took on the challenge of pulling this webinar together. It's one of the many initiatives that the LAS Commission has developed over those many years. And you see a picture here of our Zoom discussion last December, where we talked about our new work, Book 9, but also about this webinar that we are now ending. Like also Bernadette, I would like to really commemorate the great contributions of Ricardo Sobol, who has been a LAS member for many, many years, for 20 years in total. He has unfortunately succumbed to COVID-19 August last year, and we're really, really sad and shocked in ICMSF that had happened. In all his work for ICMSF, the LAS group and the community of ICMSF, Ricardo contributed so much to food safety. In LAS, he has been a member, he has been treasurer, he has been secretary. In the last 4 years, he was the president of LAS, and we all miss him so much. We also have to recognize 2 other members that we had to miss, that we are missing now very much, since they died approximately in the same period last year. Hans-Jürgen Sinell from Germany, who was a member from 1971 to 1992, and also Russ Flowers from the US, who has been a member from 1996 until 2013, and also Russ has participated a lot in the Latin America Subcommission activities in those many years. So very unfortunate that we have to miss those people, those warm people and those experts, but maybe we also see them as an inspiration for those that continue in their footsteps. It's great to have been in their community. I would like to now hand over to Marcel for the next slides.
Yeah, so you have to do the control of the slides, Leon, and so thank you. And you can see here how it used to be. How you see different things. First of all, you see Ricardo standing behind the committee, and so really standing behind the organization, the good organization of the Latin American Subcommission. You also see that at those days we were not social distancing, we were close together. We look forward to that we can have this time again. And also different from today is that all the people from South America are in their respective countries. But then at Colmic in 2016, we were nicely all together. The Latin American Subcommission has been very strong in organizing workshops in this type of conferences and also in doing the translations of the book, like I mentioned. Next slide, please. But also in translating, for instance, the subtitles, like I mentioned, but also there was a booklet and a guide to explain the food safety objective concept of the ICMSF, and that has also been translated in a lot of languages. You can find it also on our website with the Spanish and Portuguese translation, but in many more translations also. And also the Latin American Subcommission has been very active in translating this book. Next slide, please. But the greatest thing, of course, is that they set a new standards, because this is really a new thing. The webinars of ICMSF, that is a new thing that has been organized and that has been very successful. The videos are now posted on the ICMSF website for the first day and the second day. The third day is not yet over, so it's not yet posted. We have to wait for a while since that is technically arranged, and then we'll upload it there also. So you can find them at icmsf.org videos, and also on the websites from the Latin American Subcommission, from this organization where you have seen the program and so on. And as you can see on the YouTube, and also Marta already mentioned that, yesterday there were 1,052 views of this first day. So 1,052 people that view it. I looked 15 minutes ago, and now it are 1,150, so already more. So that's great. It has been got a lot of attention, but also it will continue to give a lot of attention. And also what I'm very happy, I see 120 thumbs up and no thumbs down. So very good that also a lot of people did like the webinar and even did then give a thumb up. So thank you very much for that also. Next slide, please. So I think that we should give a very big hand, and of course that is the difference with a conference, that we cannot do that now with all the people that are still online, but I will do it for them. To Marta, Bernadette, Miguel, Santana, Jeanette, Francisco, Anna, Sylvia, Maria Isabel, Christina, and Dora Marta. Thank you very much for organizing this. You can see here the committee. You see one thing which is missing, that is of course Ricardo, but he's still behind, you could say. He has been an inspiration source, and he will still guide you. And as we can see, you have been very fruitful in organizing this without him. So let's go on with it in his memory and following also his inspiration. So thank you very much, organizers, for this conference. Next slide, please. So I think to conclude, this was really a great meeting. We had many participants. We had very good discussions. We had many international speakers. We also had many people from South America, but also a lot of international audience. And that is also a great asset of how this was now organized. It was for free. Everyone could participate all over in the world. And I mentioned at the beginning that the objective of the ICMSF is to deliver good quality products with a long shelf life. And this is also a very good example because this will have a good long shelf life. It's now on YouTube. The videos can be watched, and I'm definitely going to use this also, for instance, in my education. In the next period, we have a course starting and we will relate to COVID. And I think that definitely the students will look at the presentations of today from Bernadette, Lucia, and John. We will supply that. So both in education, but also in many other aspects, this can be very fruitful. So we are all microbiologists, and I think this is a very good example of symbiosis. So we have had the Latin American Subcommission, we have the ICMSF, and we have all the participants. And all these three together have created this activity. All these three were needed, and we really needed to work together. And working together, we really came to a great achievement. So there was really mutualism involved. And there we can really see that if we cooperate, we can get to much greater heights by working together. And I think that is really a great asset and a new standard from the Latin American Subcommission, and also a new way to disseminate the thinking of the ICMSF, where we are working for good and healthy foods in our world and to have fair trade. That's what we try to achieve for the sake of our world. So thank you again for the Latin American Subcommission. Thank you to all the speakers, and also thank you very much for all the participants. It has been very active. I have also seen a lot of comments in the chat, but also a lot of questions have been asked. So again, for everyone, a big applause, and I hope that we can continue doing these type of webinars, but also that at a certain moment we'll see each other again live and in 3 dimensions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacqueline, Dr. Loris Leon. So we would like also to take this opportunity to say thank you for our sponsors, 3M, Merck, Ital, and Cork, without whom it wouldn't be possible to offer this free webinar to so many people from, not only from Latin American countries, but all over the world. So thank you very much. And thank you very much, all the speakers of all the ICMSF members who took part in this webinar. And also thank you very much, Thiago Goulart, our producer, and all his mental team who did a great job. And thank you very much also Thais Luri from Rital's team who hosted this webinar. And thank you very much for your audience. It was very great to have me to receive so many reactions and manifestations and messages. And we thank you very much for that. And I would like to see you in the near future in another webinar somewhere else. And keep safe, keep healthy, and goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Marta.
Each time there is a contamination in food or beverages, the public is made aware. What they don't see is you, mitigating risks every day, taking difficult decisions and making our food as safe as possible. Because you take your job as seriously as we do. With over 350 years experience in highly regulated industries, we understand the importance of reliability and efficiency in your lab. So be it to verify existing methods, stay on top of changing regulations, or to adopt the newest technologies. You can find it all on sigmaaldrich.com. Tailored products for each step of your workflow available on our website. We have products that are suitable for microbial and analytical needs
O FORC é um centro de pessoas, que é um centro que agrega pessoas que trabalham, que desenvolvem pesquisa aplicada em diversos pontos da ciência do alimento e da nutrição.
Já se pensava em fazer um centro de alimentos dentro da USP. E a gente achava que a USP, se ela unisse todos os fragmentos, todos os grupos que trabalham com alimentos numa única coisa, nós ficaríamos invencíveis.
Por que não? Por que não fazemos esse projeto, né? E aí nós começamos a conversar e foi um longo processo, porque foram 2 anos para a FAPESP decidir que nós tínhamos expertise suficiente para ter um centro.
A ciência do alimento, a ciência da nutrição, ela é multidisciplinar por definição. Então eu costumo brincar sempre que o mundo tem 9 bilhões de especialistas em ciência de alimentos. Todo mundo entende de alimentos, porque todo mundo come. Existe uma frase famosa do Luiz Fernando Veríssimo: o poder acaba, a visão acaba, o sexo acaba, mas a fome continua.
Uma das coisas que a gente realmente mostrou é que esse tema tem uma importância capital para o país. 30%, quase 40% do nosso PIB vem justamente desse setor, do setor da agricultura, do setor de alimentos. E isso daí tem um reflexo direto, nutrição para a população.
Nós podemos, em parceria com a indústria, desenvolver projetos que sejam cientificamente de alto padrão, aplicáveis para a indústria que beneficia a sociedade.
A pós-graduação é importantíssima porque a maior parte justamente de toda a pesquisa que é feita, ela é feita no laboratório por pós-graduandos. Quer dizer, os mestrandos e doutorandos, eles formam a maior parte, vamos dizer assim, dos nossos recursos humanos. Um recurso humano altamente especializado.
Hoje nós temos no FORC 30 jovens pesquisadores trabalhando com a gente e nós conseguimos chamar inclusive pesquisadores do exterior.
A gente percebe que existe um avanço considerável em quantidade e em qualidade também.
Uma das coisas que também a gente quer muito é que a gente tenha essa parceria com universidades e institutos de pesquisa mundiais que trabalhem com alimentos e nutrição. E isso está acontecendo de maneira bem forte.
Se vier uma indústria aqui dizendo que quer desenvolver alguma coisa, quer aprofundar um determinado tema, nós temos as competências aqui para ajudar.
Dentro de uma universidade, dentro de um laboratório, você tem a condição de trazer aquela ideia, torná-la realidade. E por isso que nós somos apaixonados pelo nosso trabalho.
Eu acho que inovação é quando você vê alguma coisa de um jeito diferente do que os outros veem.
Nós criamos lá embaixo um laboratório que é de primeiríssimo mundo e a gente consegue fazer pesquisas de altíssima qualidade.
Essa é a nossa pretensão, que a gente tenha um centro de pesquisas dentro da Universidade de São Paulo que seja independente.
Consolidar o grupo e ir para frente daí. Se tornar uma referência dentro do universo de alimentos e nutrição para o país e para o mundo.
Nós queremos continuar formando gente muito boa, mas nós queremos formar gente muito boa e produzir ciência muito boa. E como é que a ciência é muito boa? A ciência do 1970 não serve mais. A ciência do 2017 hoje ela é toda integrada, ela é toda colaborativa, ela é toda multidisciplinar, ela é toda sinérgica. O nosso centro ele está no momento certo funcionando dessa forma.
Olha, aquilo que está na nossa missão, viu? Ciência para melhorar a vida.
Uma história que começou em 1963. Com décadas dedicadas ao desenvolvimento de processos, produtos e embalagens, o Instituto de Tecnologia de Alimentos não mede esforços para se manter como referência no setor alimentício, não só no Brasil, como no mundo. Por entender a importância da inovação e segurança de alimentos, bebidas e embalagens para o consumidor, o ITAL pesquisa e presta assessoria técnica, visando a eficácia e padrões mínimos de qualidade. Além de estar atento aos diferentes perfis de consumidor, o Instituto atua sempre com ética e respeito ao meio ambiente, priorizando a análise crítica para acompanhar a evolução tecnológica e de mercado. As atividades do Vital são divididas em 3 grandes áreas. A tecnologia é desenvolvida e aplicada nas unidades especializadas em carnes, cereais, chocolates, balas, confeitos, produtos de panificação, laticínios, frutas, hortaliças e engenharias de processo. A ciência e a qualidade são prioridades dos laboratórios de análises químicas, físicas, sensoriais e microbiológicas. A embalagem é o foco dos setores especializados em materiais metálicos, vidros, plásticos, celulósicos e para distribuição e transporte. E o conhecimento vai além dos muros da instituição através de artigos, publicações e eventos. O Vital valoriza as pessoas que são força de trabalho e razão de existência. Por isso, está presente em importantes programas de governo que abrangem todas as classes e diferentes gerações. São décadas de constante reinvenção, aprendendo e ensinando, décadas de reconhecimento com a bagagem do passado e a modernidade do presente. Com funcionários qualificados, clientes, parceiros e fundações de apoio, o Vital tornou-se fundamental no setor de alimentos, bebidas e embalagens.
you.